The quiet watcher. The city streets hummed with life, even as midnight loomed on the horizon. Traffic lights cast intermittent glows on the deserted sidewalks, and the occasional hum of a passing car punctuated the stillness. The bus stop sat alone under a flickering streetlight, its glow barely illuminating the man slouched on its bench. His name was Terence. His skin, deep and smooth, caught the muted light, hinting at years of resilience etched into his features. At first glance, he seemed just another weary worker trudging through life's grind. His boots were scuffed, his shirt bore the stains of hard labor, and his broad shoulders slumped under the weight of a well-worn duffel bag. Terence's eyes, however, held a quiet intensity, a deep, unspoken wisdom that betrayed the story of a life far more complex than his tired exterior suggested. The streets were quieter than usual, the echo of a distant siren, the only sound interrupting the night's silence. Terence sat unmoving, his gaze fixed on the horizon, as though searching for something beyond the reach of his tired eyes. Tonight, he wasn't just waiting for a bus, he was waiting for solace, a moment of reprieve from the endless cycle of labor and responsibility. From a distance, a sharp laugh shattered the stillness. A group of young men approached, their voices carrying an edge of recklessness. 4 of them, no older than their mid-20s, strolled toward the bus stop, their energy filling the air with an unease Terence could feel. They were dressed in sagging jeans and oversized hoodies, their bravado practically dripping off them. Terence's posture remained steady, his eyes flicking briefly toward them before returning to the dim horizon. "Yo, old man," one of them called out, his voice laced with mocking enthusiasm. Terence ignored the jeer, gripping his duffel bag tighter. Years of discipline had taught him patience, restraint, and the power of silence. He inhaled deeply, centering himself against the tide of aggression threatening to pull him in. "You deaf or something?" Another voice chimed in, his tone sharper, the mockery more pronounced. Still, Terence didn't respond. He remained as still as the bench beneath him, his mind assessing the situation with the precision of someone who'd seen far worse. Terence hadn't always been this quiet figure at a bus stop. Years ago, he was known by a different name. Sergeant Terence Cole of the United States Marine Corps. 2 tours overseas had shaped him into a man of iron will and calculated precision. The battlefield had been his crucible, and he emerged from it sharper, stronger, and deeply scared. But civilian life had its battles too, ones that didn't end when the enemy retreated. Bills, unemployment, and a world that seemed to forget its heroes quickly chipped away at the man he once was. Still, Terence endured, always choosing dignity over despair. "Hey, you too good to talk to us," another young man sneered, stepping closer to the bench. The laughter of his companions grew louder, emboldened by his bravado. Terence finally glanced their way, his gaze steady, unwavering. "I'm just waiting for my bus," he replied, his voice low and calm. The simplicity of his response seemed to frustrate them further. The leader, a wiry young man with a tattoo snaking up his neck, smirked. "Man, look at you," he said, stepping closer. "Sitting there like you're somebody." Terence adjusted the strap of his duffel bag, his movements deliberate and unhurried. He didn't speak again, but his silence carried more weight than their taunts. To them, he was a tired man past his prime. To Terence, they were children playing at a game they didn't understand. The tattooed leader bent down, his face mere inches from Terence's. "What's in the bag, old man? Your lunch? Or maybe something worth taking?" Terence's fingers tightened on the strap, his grip firm but composed. "Nothing you need to worry about," he said evenly, his tone neither threatening nor submissive. The leader leaned back and laughed. "Hear that? He thinks he's tough." He gestured to his friends. "Maybe we should teach him a lesson." The tension thickened like a storm gathering strength. The young men circled closer, their laughter taking on a sharper edge. Terence remained seated, his body still but ready. His mind catalogued every detail, their postures, their spacing, their movements. Years of training honed his instincts to read situations like these. "Yo, grab his bag," one of them called out. The tattooed leader reached forward, his hand outstretched toward Terrence's duffel bag. In that moment, time seemed to slow. Terrence's heart rate didn't spike. It slowed, his focus narrowing like the sight of a rifle. He stood suddenly, his height and presence startling the group into silence. "You don't want to do this," Terrence said, his voice steady and calm, yet filled with an authority that silenced even the most brash of his adversaries. His gaze swept over the young men, his posture towering and unshakable. For a moment, the leader hesitated, his bravado wavering under Terrence's unwavering stare. But youth and pride are a dangerous combination, and the leader's uncertainty quickly turned to anger. "Man, you don't scare me," he said, shoving Terrence's shoulder. Terrence didn't move. Instead, he exhaled slowly, his breath steady and controlled. "Last chance," he said softly, his voice carrying a weight that silenced even the echoes of the city. But the leader wasn't listening. He swung, his fist aimed at Terrence's face. And in that instant, the quiet, unassuming man they thought they could intimidate revealed the truth they never saw coming. A man's silent resolve. The punch came fast but clumsy, telegraphed with the overconfidence of someone who had never been in a real fight. For Terrence, it was instinct. His body moved before his mind had time to process, a sidestep, precise and fluid, that left the young man's fist striking nothing but air. The momentum carried the leader forward, and he stumbled, his balance disrupted. Terrence's voice cut through the night like a blade. "Enough." It wasn't a shout or a plea. It was a command, sharp and decisive. For a moment, the young men hesitated, their bravado faltering under the weight of Terrence's presence. The leader straightened, shaking off his embarrassment, and glared at Terrence with renewed defiance. He couldn't back down now, not in front of his crew. "Old man's got some moves," one of the others muttered, his tone mocking but with a hint of uncertainty. The leader sneered. "You think you're smart, huh? Quick on your feet. Let's see how quick you are with all of us." Terrence stood his ground, his posture calm but ready. He shifted his weight slightly, the faintest movement, but one that betrayed his readiness to act. His eyes scanned the group, reading them as though they were an open book. Each man's stance, the way they held their shoulders, even the direction of their gaze. He noted it all. "Walk away," Terrence said, his voice steady, his words hanging in the cool night air. "This doesn't have to go where you think it will." The young men exchanged glances, their confidence faltering further. But the leader wasn't ready to let it go. His pride demanded he prove something, to himself, to his friends, to the stranger who had dared to stand against him. "You don't tell us what to do," the leader spat, stepping closer. His fists clenched, his chest puffed out in an attempt to appear larger than he was. "You're just some tired old man waiting for a bus." Terrence's lips tightened into a thin line, his patience waning but his control unshaken. "A tired man, yes," he said quietly, "but not a weak one." The leader lunged again, this time with more force. His friends followed, their bravado bolstered by the leader's aggression. It was the moment Terrence had been trying to avoid, but had been preparing for since they approached. The first attack came from the leader, a sloppy punch aimed at Terrence's jaw. Terrence deflected it with ease, his arm moving in a tight arc that sent the leader's fist past his head. With his other hand, he gripped the leader's wrist, twisting it just enough to force the man to his knees without breaking anything. A second attacker lunged from the side, aiming to grab Terrence's arm. Terrence pivoted, using the momentum of the second man's charge to send him stumbling past. The third swung a makeshift weapon, a metal rod he'd pulled from his jacket. But Terrence sidestepped, his movements smooth and controlled. He caught the rod mid-swing, wrenching it free and tossing it aside in one fluid motion. It was over in seconds. The leader was on the ground, groaning and clutching his wrist. The second attacker lay sprawled on the pavement, winded from his own momentum. The third man stood frozen, his hands half raised, unsure whether to attack or retreat. The fourth man, the quietest of the group, had stayed back, his eyes wide with disbelief. He hadn't joined the scuffle, and now he looked like he wanted nothing more than to disappear. Terence straightened, his movements calm and deliberate, as though he hadn't just disarmed and disabled 3 men. He looked at the group, his gaze firm but devoid of anger. "Is this how you want to live?" he asked, his voice low but carrying across the space between them. "Running around looking for trouble, picking fights with strangers. It's not strength, it's foolishness." The leader scrambled to his feet, his pride bruised more than his body. He opened his mouth to retort, but no words came. He looked at Terence, truly seeing him for the first time, not just a tired man on a bench, but someone who carried himself with an authority they couldn't match. "Who the hell are you?" the leader finally asked, his voice shaking with a mix of fear and anger. Terence's expression didn't change. He adjusted the strap of his duffel bag and said, "Someone who's been through more than you can imagine. Someone who's tired of watching kids like you throw your lives away for nothing." The words hit harder than any punch could have. The young men exchanged glances, their earlier bravado evaporating into the cool night air. Terence turned slightly, as if to leave, but paused. "You have a choice," he said, his back to them. "You can walk away and learn from this, or you can keep going down this road and see where it takes you. But I promise you, it won't end well." The fourth man, the quiet one, spoke for the first time. "We should go," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. The leader hesitated, his fists clenching and unclenching as he wrestled with his pride. Finally, he spat on the ground and muttered, "Whatever. Let's get out of here." The group retreated, their footsteps echoing down the empty street. The leader glanced back once, his expression a mix of anger and something else, perhaps respect, or maybe fear. Terence watched them go, his posture relaxing only when they were out of sight. He sat back down on the bench, the adrenaline fading and exhaustion returning like an old companion. The distant hum of the approaching bus reached his ears, and he allowed himself a moment to exhale deeply. He wasn't angry. He wasn't even relieved. What he felt was something more complicated, a mix of pity for the young men and a quiet satisfaction that, for tonight at least, he had been able to stop something that could have gone far worse. The bus arrived with a low hiss, its doors folding open to reveal a dimly lit interior. Terence stepped aboard, nodding to the driver before finding a seat near the back. He placed his duffel bag on the floor and leaned against the window, the city lights blurring into streaks as the bus began to move. As the hum of the engine filled his ears, Terence closed his eyes. His thoughts drifted, not to the confrontation but to the young men themselves. He thought of their faces, defiant, uncertain, and in the end, humbled. He wondered if they would remember this night, if it would plant a seed of change in their lives. Terence sighed, his mind wandering to his own youth, to the men who had guided him, shaped him, and taught him the lessons he had carried ever since. Life, he knew, was a series of choices. Tonight, those young men had made one. Tomorrow, they would have another chance to make a better one. Reflection in the rearview. The bus rattled along the uneven streets, its dim lights casting a faint glow over the few passengers scattered in the seats. Terence sat near the back, his duffel bag resting at his feet. He leaned against the window, the cool glass pressing against his temple as he stared out at the blurred city lights. Each passing block seemed to dissolve into the next, but Terence's mind wasn't on the journey. It was back at the bus stop, replaying the confrontation in sharp detail. His reflection in the glass stared back at him, older and more tired than he cared to admit. He saw the scar above his brow, a souvenir from a distant battlefield, and the faint lines around his eyes that spoke of long nights and harder days. Tonight hadn't been the first time someone underestimated him. It likely wouldn't be the last. But something about those young men lingered in his thoughts. Terence shifted in his seat, adjusting the strap of his duffel bag. The bus jolted as it hit a pothole, and he closed his eyes, letting the vibrations resonate through him. In the quiet of the ride, his thoughts began to take shape, unwinding like a tightly coiled spring. Years ago, Terrence was not the man sitting silently on this bus. He had been a soldier, a Marine, wearing his uniform with pride and purpose. The deserts of the Middle East had been his proving ground, a place where every decision was a matter of life and death. His squad had relied on him, and he on them. Those bonds, forged in the crucible of war, had given him strength he never knew he possessed. But war had its cost. Terrence remembered the weight of his rifle, the endless heat, and the constant hum of tension that never allowed him to fully rest. The faces of his comrades flashed in his mind, some laughing in moments of rare reprieve, others frozen in memory, forever young and vibrant, stolen by the unforgiving hand of war. When he returned home, Terrence thought the hardest battles were behind him. He was wrong. The transition from Marine to civilian was a battlefield of its own, one where the enemy wasn't visible, and the rules weren't clear. Job interviews felt like interrogations. Bills piled up faster than he could manage. People thanked him for his service, but didn't understand the weight of those words. He had traded the battlefield for a different kind of fight, a daily struggle to keep moving forward. The bus slowed to a halt at a red light, the brakes hissing softly. Terrence opened his eyes, glancing around at the other passengers. An elderly woman clutched her purse tightly, staring at the floor. A young man in a hoodie scrolled through his phone, oblivious to the world around him. A mother with a sleeping child leaned her head back, her own exhaustion evident. Terrence wondered about their stories. What burdens did they carry? What battles had they fought today? His gaze returned to the young man, and for a moment he saw the leader of the group from earlier. The arrogance, the posturing, it wasn't unique. Terrence had seen it before, in young soldiers fresh out of boot camp, eager to prove themselves but blind to the reality of what lay ahead. He sighed, leaning back in his seat. Those young men at the bus stop weren't inherently bad. They were lost, caught in a cycle of pride and insecurity that led them to pick fights they couldn't win. Terrence had wanted to walk away, to avoid confrontation, but he also knew the danger of letting such behavior go unchecked. Sometimes, a hard lesson was the only one that stuck. His mind drifted to a memory, a night years ago, not unlike this one. He was a young Marine on leave, sitting in a dingy diner near the base. A group of rowdy locals had wandered in, their voices loud and their intentions clear. They didn't take kindly to the military presence in their town and had zeroed in on Terrence and his friends. The situation escalated quickly. Words were exchanged, fists were raised, and Terrence found himself in the middle of a brawl he hadn't started. It was a chaotic blur of shouts, punches, and overturned chairs. When the dust settled, Terrence stood victorious but bloodied, his knuckles raw and his pride intact. But the victory felt hollow. The confrontation hadn't solved anything. It had only deepened the divide between them and the locals. His commanding officer, a grizzled man with decades of experience, had pulled him aside the next day. "Cole," he'd said, his voice heavy with disappointment, "strength isn't about who hits harder. It's about knowing when to walk away. Winning a fight doesn't make you a man. Choosing not to fight does." Those words stayed with Terrence, shaping the man he would become. They echoed in his mind tonight as he thought of the young men at the bus stop. They were desperate to prove themselves, just as he had been. But they lacked the guidance he'd been fortunate enough to receive. The bus rumbled back to life, continuing its route through the quiet streets. Terrence shifted his gaze to the window again, watching as the city began to thin out. The towering buildings gave way to modest homes and small businesses, their neon signs glowing faintly in the darkness. He thought of his own neighborhood, a place where people worked hard and kept their heads down. It wasn't glamorous, but it was home. His apartment was small and sparsely furnished, but it was a refuge from the chaos of the outside world. The thought of his recliner waiting for him brought a faint smile to his lips. Still, the events of the night lingered. He wondered if the young men had gone home, if they were laughing about the encounter or reflecting on it. Would they remember him as the tired man who didn't fight back until he had no choice? Or would they see him as something more, a man who could have hurt them, but chose not to? Terence hoped for the latter. He hoped they would learn from this night, that they would see it as a turning point rather than just another failed attempt to prove themselves. The thought brought him a small measure of peace, though he knew the odds were slim. As the bus neared his stop, Terence stood, slinging his duffel bag over his shoulder. The driver nodded to him as he approached the door. "Long night?" the driver asked, his tone conversational. Terence chuckled softly. "You could say that." The driver smiled knowingly. "Well, get some rest. Tomorrow's another day." Terence stepped off the bus, the cool night air hitting him like a balm. He walked the last few blocks to his apartment, the familiar sounds of his neighborhood soothing in their predictability. Dogs barked in the distance, a television blared from an open window, and the faint smell of someone's late-night cooking wafted through the air. When he reached his building, Terence climbed the stairs to his apartment, his legs heavy but his mind lighter. Inside, he dropped his duffel bag by the door and sank into his recliner. The worn leather creaked under his weight, but it welcomed him like an old friend. Terence stared at the ceiling, his thoughts finally settling. Tonight had been another battle, one of many in a life filled with them. But it wasn't the fight that defined him. It was his choice to end it. And in that, he found a quiet strength that no one could take from him. The echo of choices, the faint creak of Terence's recliner filled the silence of his modest apartment as he leaned back, staring at the ceiling. The room was quiet, save for the occasional hum of a passing car outside and the rhythmic ticking of an old clock on the wall. The events of the night played out in his mind like a slow-moving reel, each moment vivid, every word spoken echoing louder than the last. He closed his eyes, but rest didn't come easily. His body was exhausted, yet his mind was restless, tugging him back to the bus stop, to the group of young men whose bravado had almost led them down a path they couldn't return from. He replayed their faces in his mind, the leader with the defiant smirk, the hesitant follower, the one who stood frozen, and the quiet one who seemed out of place among the chaos. Terence rubbed his temples, his calloused fingers brushing against the fine lines etched into his skin. He couldn't help but wonder what had led them there, to that moment of reckless posturing. Life didn't deal everyone the same hand. He knew that better than most. Had they grown up in broken homes? Were they angry at a world that seemed indifferent to their struggles? Or were they simply victims of their own insecurities, searching for a sense of control in a life that offered them so little? Years ago, he might not have thought twice about them. Back then, he was a young Marine, driven by a sense of duty and the unyielding belief that strength was measured by action. But the years had softened the edges of his perspective, replacing them with something more nuanced. Strength, he had learned, wasn't about how hard you could hit. It was about restraint, about knowing when to act and when to stand down. He thought back to his own youth, growing up in the rough neighborhoods of Baltimore. Life hadn't been kind to him either. He'd seen his share of violence, had friends who'd fallen into cycles of crime and despair. But there had been people, mentors, coaches, neighbors who had seen something in him worth nurturing. They'd given him the tools to carve out a different path, to channel his anger and frustration into something meaningful. The Marines had been his salvation. They'd given him structure, discipline, and a sense of purpose. But they'd also exposed him to the harsh realities of the world. He'd seen how quickly choices could define a person's life, how one decision, one moment, could set the course for years to come. It was that understanding that made tonight weigh so heavily on him. Terence stood and walked to the small kitchen, the wooden floor creaking beneath his boots. He opened the fridge, its light illuminating the sparse contents: milk, a few eggs, leftover rice, and a container of takeout from 2 nights ago. He grabbed a bottle of water and leaned against the counter, sipping slowly as his thoughts continued to churn. He couldn't shake the look in the quiet one's eyes, the youngest of the group, who had hung back while his friends tried to provoke him. There had been fear there, yes, but also something else. Hesitation, a flicker of doubt that set him apart from the others. Terrence had seen that look before, in himself, years ago, when he'd stood at the edge of choices that could have destroyed him. The quiet one had wanted to leave. Terrence was sure of it. But fear of being ostracized, of losing the approval of his peers, had kept him rooted in place. Terrence knew that fear too, the fear of standing alone. It was a fear that had kept many good men silent in moments that mattered most. "Kids got a chance," Terrence muttered to himself, his voice low and gravelly. He set the bottle down and stared out the small kitchen window. The night outside was still, the streetlights casting long shadows on the empty pavement. If he learns to take it. His thoughts drifted back to the leader, the one with the tattoo snaking up his neck. The young man had been full of bluster, his words sharp but empty. Terrence recognized the type, angry at the world, desperate to prove something. He wasn't born that way. No one was. Something had shaped him, molded him into the person Terrence had encountered tonight. Terrence sighed and ran a hand over his face. He'd seen too many young men like that during his years as a Marine, not in uniform, but in the streets of the countries he'd been deployed to. Boys who had been hardened by circumstances beyond their control, who'd turned to violence because it was the only language they knew. Some of them had fought against him, others alongside him. And every one of them carried a story, a reason for why they were the way they were. He wondered what the young man's story was. Had he grown up in a home where anger was the only emotion freely expressed? Had he been taught that power came from domination, from fear? Or was he simply lost, drifting through a world that seemed intent on ignoring him? Terrence wished he could have done more than just stop the fight. He wished he could have sat those boys down and talked to them, shared his story, his struggles, his lessons. But he knew that wasn't how life worked. Change wasn't something you could force on someone. It had to come from within. The clock chimed softly, pulling Terrence from his thoughts. He glanced at it and realized how late it had gotten. The weight of the day, combined with the mental toll of the evening, was beginning to catch up to him. But as he returned to his recliner, he felt a flicker of something he hadn't expected. Hope. Hope that the quiet one might find the courage to step away from the group. Hope that the leader might one day look back on tonight and see it as a turning point. Hope that in some small way, his actions might have planted a seed. Terrence leaned back, letting the worn leather of the chair envelop him. He closed his eyes, the faint hum of the city outside lulling him toward sleep. As he drifted off, he whispered a silent prayer. Not for himself, but for the young men who had crossed his path tonight. A prayer that they would find their way, that they would choose a different road before it was too late. And with that, the quiet man who had seen more battles than he cared to remember allowed himself to rest, knowing he had done what he could. Ripples in the night. The next morning dawned quietly, the soft light of early sunrise filtering through Terrence's window. The familiar creak of his recliner echoed as he sat up, rubbing the sleep from his eyes. His body ached, a testament to years of labor and wear, but his mind felt sharper. The previous night's events had settled like sediment in a stream, leaving the water above clear enough for reflection. He rose, shuffled into the kitchen, and started his morning ritual, a simple one. Coffee brewed in an old drip machine as he prepared a modest breakfast of toast and eggs. He ate in silence, the rhythmic ticking of the kitchen clock the only sound in the room. As he sipped his coffee, his thoughts drifted once more to the young men he'd encountered. What had become of them after they left? Had the leader nursed his bruised pride into something dangerous, or had the confrontation given him pause? Terrence sighed, setting his mug down. He couldn't answer those questions, but he couldn't shake them either. The encounter had left an imprint on him, and he suspected it had done the same for them. In the quiet of his morning, he resolved to go about his day, carrying the hope that the lessons of the night would ripple outward in ways he might never see. Across town, in a modest apartment complex, the leader of the group sat at his kitchen table, A scowl etched across his face. His name was Jaden, and his wrist throbbed with a dull ache from where Terrence had twisted it. He stared at the bruising, flexing his fingers experimentally, the pain stoking the fire of his anger. His friends had scattered after the incident, each making excuses to head home, their bravado evaporating into the cool night air. Jaden had walked alone, his thoughts swirling with a mixture of humiliation and rage. The man at the bus stop, quiet, unassuming, had dismantled them without breaking a sweat. But what stung more than the physical defeat was the way the man had looked at him. Not with fear, but with pity. It was a look Jaden couldn't shake. He slammed his fist on the table, startling his younger brother, Malik, who had been quietly eating a bowl of cereal across from him. "You good?" Malik asked, his voice cautious. "I'm fine," Jaden snapped, though his tone betrayed him. Malik studied him for a moment, his spoon hovering over the bowl. At 15, Malik was more observant than Jaden gave him credit for. He noticed the way his brother's hands clenched, the way his jaw tightened, the way he avoided looking directly at him. "You don't look fine," Malik said carefully. "You look mad. Like something happened." Jaden glared at him, but softened under his brother's steady gaze. Malik wasn't like the others. He was quieter, more thoughtful. Jaden often felt the weight of being the older brother, the protector, the one who had to show strength even when he didn't feel it. "Just had a rough night," Jaden muttered, looking away. Malik nodded, but he didn't press further. Instead, he said, "You always told me being mad doesn't fix anything." Jaden froze, his brother's words hitting him harder than he expected. It was something he had told Malik often, usually when Malik got frustrated with school or their home life. Their father had left years ago, and their mother worked 2 jobs to keep the lights on. Jaden had taken it upon himself to fill the gap, but somewhere along the way, his own anger had consumed him. He stood abruptly, pushing his chair back with a screech. "I'm going out," he said, grabbing his hoodie and heading for the door before Malik could respond. Terrence, unaware of the ripples his actions had set in motion, went about his day. He spent the morning repairing cars at the auto shop where he worked, his hand steady and sure as he tightened bolts and replaced parts. The work was familiar, almost meditative, and it kept his mind occupied. At lunchtime, he sat on a bench outside the shop, eating a sandwich and watching the world go by. A group of teenagers passed by, laughing and joking, their energy infectious. Terrence smiled faintly, but his mind wandered to Jaden and the others. He wondered if they had anyone in their lives to guide them, to show them a different path. His thoughts were interrupted by the shop's owner, a wiry man named Carl. "Hey, Terrence," Carl said, leaning against the doorframe. "You good? You've been quiet today." Terrence chuckled. "When am I not quiet?" Carl smirked. "Fair point. But you seem, I don't know, like you've got something on your mind." Terrence hesitated, then said, "Just thinking about how some people get lost along the way. Makes you wonder if there's anything you can do to help them." Carl nodded, his expression thoughtful. "Yeah, well, sometimes all you can do is point them in the right direction. Whether they walk that way is up to them." The words resonated with Terrence, and he nodded in agreement. Maybe Carl was right. Maybe the only thing he could do was hope that his actions had planted a seed. Later that afternoon, Jaden found himself wandering the streets, his hands shoved deep in his hoodie pockets. He wasn't sure where he was going. He just needed to move, to escape the confines of his apartment and the weight of his thoughts. He ended up at the park, where he sat on a bench near the basketball courts, watching a pickup game unfold. His mind drifted back to the man at the bus stop, the quiet authority he'd exuded. Jaden had never met anyone like him before, someone who didn't need to shout or throw punches to command respect. It gnawed at him, the way the man had looked at him, not with anger but with disappointment. He pulled out his phone and scrolled aimlessly through social media, trying to distract himself. But nothing could quiet the voice in his head that kept asking, "What are you doing with your life?" Nearby, A group of kids no older than Malik played on the swings, their laughter carrying on the breeze. Jaden watched them, a pang of something he couldn't quite name settling in his chest. He thought of Malik, of the responsibility he felt to be a role model for his younger brother. And then he thought of the man's words, "You can walk away and learn from this." For the first time in a long time, Jaden wondered if he could be more than the person he was now, if he could change. As the sun dipped low on the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink, Terrence returned home. He dropped his duffel bag by the door and sank into his recliner, the day's labor weighing heavily on him. But as he sat there, a faint sense of peace settled over him. He didn't know if his actions had made a difference, but he knew he had done what he could. And somewhere across town, Jaden sat in the fading light, wrestling with the choices that lay before him. The quiet man at the bus stop had left a mark. And though Jaden didn't know it yet, the ripples of that encounter were beginning to spread. Jaden remained on the bench, the vibrant colors of the sunset casting long shadows over the park. His phone buzzed in his pocket, and he glanced at the screen. A message from one of his friends from the night before. "Yo, what's good? Meet up later." He stared at the text, his thumb hovering over the keyboard. Normally, he wouldn't hesitate. The group had been his outlet, a place to let off steam and feel like he belonged, even if that belonging came with its share of trouble. But tonight, something felt different. The man's voice echoed in his mind again. "You have a choice. Don't waste it." Jaden put the phone back in his pocket without replying. Instead, he leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees as he watched the kids on the swings. One of them, a boy about Malik's age, called out to his younger sister to follow him to the slides. The girl hesitated, clutching the swing chains tightly, but her brother's encouragement gave her the confidence to hop off and run after him. The interaction was simple, but it struck a chord in Jaden. He thought about Malik, how his younger brother looked up to him, even when he didn't deserve it. Malik deserved better. Their mother, who worked tirelessly to keep a roof over their heads, deserved better. And deep down, Jaden realized he deserved better too. Across town, Terrence prepared for his evening routine. He sat at the small table in his kitchen, a book in one hand and a pen in the other, jotting notes in the margins as he read. It was a habit he picked up during his time in the Marines, a way to focus his mind and remind himself that growth didn't stop when the battles ended. Tonight's book was one of his favorites, a collection of essays on resilience and leadership. The words on the page resonated with him more than usual. One passage in particular caught his eye. Leadership is not about commanding respect. It's about inspiring change. True leaders don't demand. They guide. They show by example. He set the book down and leaned back, staring at the worn table. The events of the previous night came flooding back. He hadn't thought of himself as a leader in that moment, but the memory of the quiet young man in the group gave him pause. Terrence had seen something in him, a flicker of hesitation, a glimpse of potential. Maybe that was enough. He exhaled deeply and muttered to himself, "Sometimes all it takes is one spark." At the park, Jaden's phone buzzed again. This time, it was Malik. "Mom's asking if you're okay. She says dinner's almost ready." Jaden smiled faintly, picturing his brother's concern. Malik was always trying to bridge the gap between Jaden and their mother, even when the tension felt insurmountable. Jaden typed a quick reply. "On my way." He stood and began walking home, his steps slower than usual as he mulled over the night before and what it meant for him now. The streets were quieter in the early evening, the city winding down from the bustle of the day. He passed a community center with its lights still on, the sounds of basketballs bouncing and kids laughing spilling out onto the sidewalk. Jaden paused, peering through the glass doors. Inside, a group of teens played a pickup game while a coach barked instructions from the sideline. The sight brought a pang of nostalgia. He'd spent countless hours in places like this when he was Malik's age, back before life started to feel like a fight he couldn't win. Something tugged at him, a small voice urging him to step inside. But he hesitated, unsure if he belonged there anymore. He stood rooted in place, watching as the players moved across the court with an easy invite. Finally, he shook his head and kept walking. Maybe another time, he told himself, though the thought lingered long after he left. When Jaden arrived home, the smell of his mother's cooking greeted him at the door. Malik was on the couch, a notebook and pencil in hand as he worked on homework. Their mother glanced up from the stove, her face lined with exhaustion but softened by relief at seeing him. "You're late," she said, her tone more observant than accusatory. "Yeah," Jaden replied, slipping off his hoodie and hanging it by the door. "Went for a walk." Her eyes lingered on him for a moment before she nodded and turned back to the stove. "Dinner's almost ready. Set the table." Jaden did as she asked, his movements automatic, but his mind elsewhere. As he placed the plates and utensils, he glanced at Malik, who was still scribbling in his notebook. "What are you working on?" "English," Malik replied without looking up. "We're supposed to write about someone we look up to." Jaden froze for a moment. "Yeah. Who are you writing about?" Malik hesitated, then shrugged. "I was gonna write about you." The words hit Jaden like a punch to the gut. He stared at his brother, unsure of how to respond. Malik finally looked up, his expression earnest. "But I don't know if I have enough to say." Jaden felt a lump rise in his throat, but he swallowed it down. He nodded, forcing a small smile. "You'll figure it out." Malik shrugged again and went back to his notebook, but Jaden couldn't shake the weight of what he'd said. He thought of the man at the bus stop, of the quiet authority he carried, and wondered if he could ever be that for Malik. The thought scared him, but it also gave him a strange sense of purpose. As the evening wore on, Jaden sat on his bed, staring at the ceiling. His friends had sent more messages, their words brimming with plans for the weekend. But for the first time, he didn't feel like answering. Instead, he thought of the community center, of the kids playing basketball, and the coach on the sidelines. He picked up his phone, opened a browser, and searched for the center's hours. The screen filled with information, and he made a mental note. Tomorrow, he thought. I'll check it out tomorrow. The decision felt small, almost insignificant. But for Jaden, it was the first step in a journey he hadn't realized he was ready to take. Meanwhile, Terrence sat in his recliner, the soft hum of the television filling the room. He didn't know it, but the ripples of his actions were already spreading. Somewhere across the city, a young man was beginning to change. And though Terrence would likely never see the results, the knowledge that he had planted a seed was enough. Paths converging. The morning sun spilled into Terrence's apartment, golden light casting long shadows on the floor. It was Saturday, a rare day off for him, but he still woke early, his body accustomed to the rhythm of labor and discipline. He stretched, the creak of his joints reminding him of years spent pushing his body to its limits. After a simple breakfast of oatmeal and coffee, he decided to take a walk. The city had a way of coming alive on weekends, and Terrence found comfort in watching its rhythms unfold. He grabbed his worn jacket and stepped outside. The air was crisp, the faint smell of rain lingering from the night before. As he walked, the sounds of the neighborhood surrounded him. Children laughing, dogs barking, and the faint hum of music from open windows. Terrence found himself heading toward the community center, a place he hadn't visited in years, but had always respected for the work it did in keeping kids off the streets. Jaden, meanwhile, was standing outside the same community center, hands shoved deep into his hoodie pockets. He'd been there for almost 10 minutes, watching kids and parents filter in and out, the sounds of bouncing basketballs and chatter spilling onto the sidewalk. He felt out of place, a weight pressing down on his chest as he debated whether to go inside. The night before, he'd stared at the center's website for hours, reading about their programs and mentorship opportunities. He didn't know exactly why he'd come. Maybe it was guilt, or maybe it was the voice of the man at the bus stop still echoing in his mind. Either way, he was here, though he wasn't sure he belonged. A group of younger boys brushed past him, laughing and shoving each other playfully as they entered the building. Jaden watched them go, their energy and camaraderie reminding him of his younger self, back when life felt simpler, before anger and pride had clouded his judgment. Taking a deep breath, he stepped forward and pushed open the door. The community center was alive with activity. Kids of all ages ran between rooms, some heading for the gym, others gathering in the common areas. The air smelled faintly of popcorn and floor polish, a mix that Jaden found oddly comforting. He lingered near the entrance, unsure of where to go. "Can I help you?" a voice asked. Jaden turned to see a woman in her 40s, her hair pulled back into a practical ponytail. She wore a polo shirt with the center's logo embroidered on the chest and a warm, welcoming smile. Yeah," Jaden said, scratching the back of his neck. "I was just looking around." The woman nodded, her expression understanding. "First time here?" "Yeah." "Well, welcome," she said, gesturing toward the main hallway. "We've got a lot going on today. Basketball in the gym, some art workshops in the back rooms, and a mentorship session in the lounge if you're interested." "Mentorship?" Jaden asked, the word catching his attention. "Yeah, we've got some great folks who volunteer their time to talk to the kids, help them out with school, life, you name it. If you're looking for something like that, you're in the right place." Jaden hesitated, but nodded. "Thanks." The woman pointed him toward the lounge and walked off, leaving Jaden to make his way down the hallway. He felt a mix of nerves and curiosity, his steps slow as he approached the open door of the lounge. Inside, a small group of teens sat in a circle, their voices low but engaged. A man stood at the center, speaking with quiet authority. Jaden froze when he saw who it was. It was him, the man from the bus stop. Terrence hadn't expected to end up in the mentorship session that morning. He'd stopped by the community center out of curiosity, intending only to observe. But when one of the coordinators recognized him and asked if he'd be willing to share some of his experiences with the teens, he couldn't refuse. Now, as he stood before them, he felt an unexpected sense of purpose. "Life doesn't hand you a manual," Terrence was saying. "You figure it out as you go. But the choices you make, those matter. They shape who you become." He looked around the room, meeting the eyes of each teen in turn. Most of them nodded, their expressions thoughtful. One boy raised his hand. "What if you've already messed up?" the boy asked, his voice tinged with uncertainty. Terrence smiled faintly. "Everyone messes up. It's what you do after that counts. Owning your mistakes, learning from them, and making better choices. That's where real strength comes from." Jaden stood in the doorway, his heart pounding. Hearing the man's voice again brought back the intensity of the night before, but this time it wasn't anger or humiliation he felt. It was something deeper, an unsettling mix of shame and hope. Terrence caught sight of Jaden then, his expression flickering with recognition. For a moment, the two men stared at each other, the weight of their shared encounter hanging between them. But Terrence didn't call him out or show any sign of judgment. Instead, he gave a small nod, as if to say, "It's okay. You're welcome here." Jaden hesitated, then stepped into the room, taking an empty seat at the back. The conversation continued, but Jaden barely registered the words. His mind raced, trying to make sense of the moment. He hadn't expected to see Terrence again, much less in a place like this. As the session wrapped up, the teens began to disperse, some stopping to thank Terrence before heading out. Jaden stayed in his seat, unsure of what to do. Finally, he stood and approached Terrence, his hands shoved deep into his hoodie pockets. "Hey," he said awkwardly. Terrence turned, his expression calm but curious. "Hey." Jaden looked down at the floor, struggling to find the words. I didn't expect to see you here." "Didn't expect to see you either," Terrence replied, his tone neutral but not unkind. "What brings you here?" Jaden shrugged. "I don't know. Just trying to figure some stuff out." Terence nodded, his gaze steady. That's a good place to start. They stood in silence for a moment before Jaden said, "Look, about last night. I was out of line. We all were." Terence studied him for a moment, then said, "It takes courage to admit that. But what matters is what you do next." Jaden nodded, his shoulders relaxing slightly. "I don't want to be that guy anymore." "Then don't be," Terence said simply. "You've got a chance to change. It won't be easy, but it's worth it." Jaden met his gaze, the weight of Terence's words sinking in. For the first time in a long time, he felt a spark of something he hadn't dared to hope for, the possibility of a better path. As Jaden left the center that day, he carried Terence's words with him. And as Terence watched him go, he felt a quiet satisfaction, knowing he had helped plant a seed. The ripples of their encounter were still spreading, their paths converging in ways neither of them could have predicted.